I was halfway through changing the spark plugs on my snowmobile when Brenda Morrison came marching across my driveway like she owned the place, clutching a clipboard to her chest like it was some kind of holy document. "Mr. Bartlett," she called out in that nasal voice that could strip paint off walls, "we need to talk about your flagrant violations of the Pine Valley Estates community guidelines." I wiped the grease off my hands with a rag and looked up at her. Brenda was exactly what you'd picture when you heard the word, HOA president, mid-40s, with a severe blonde bob that looked like it had been cut with a protractor, and the kind of tight-lipped expression that suggested she'd never experienced joy in her entire life. She wore a North Face jacket that probably cost more than my snowmobile's new engine, and her designer snow boots had never seen actual snow in their pampered existence. "What violations?" I asked, even though I knew this wasn't going to be a reasonable conversation. It never was with Brenda. "This." She gestured dramatically at my snowmobile like it was a dead body. "You've been using this machine to access trails that run through our community's designated winter recreation areas." I stood up, crossing my arms. "You mean the trails I've been using for the past 15 years? Those trails are maintained by the Pine Valley Estates HOA for the exclusive use of our residents engaging in approved winter activities. Snowmobiling is not on the approved list." She flipped through her clipboard with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "Approved activities include cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, winter hiking, and sledding in designated zones only." "Brenda, I've been snowmobiling on those trails since before this HOA even existed." "That's irrelevant. The bylaws were updated in our September meeting, which you didn't attend, by the way. Article 12. Section 4 now explicitly prohibits motorized vehicles on all community trails between November 1st and March 31st. You received the updated bylaws in your email." I probably had received them, buried in the weekly avalanche of HOA emails that I'd learned to filter directly to trash. That was my mistake, apparently. "So what? You're banning me from snowmobiling." "I'm enforcing the community guidelines that every resident agreed to follow when they purchased property in Pine Valley Estates." She pulled out a sheet of paper from her clipboard and thrust it toward me. "This is your official warning. If we catch you on those trails again with this vehicle, you'll face a fine of $500 per incident. Continued violations could result in legal action." I took the paper, reading through the dense legalese. It was all there, officially stamped and signed. "This is ridiculous. Half the neighborhood snowmobiles. Actually, you're the only one who still does. Everyone else has transitioned to more community-friendly winter activities." She said it with this smug satisfaction, like she'd personally civilized the neighborhood, community-friendly. "They're snowmobiling over in Meadow Ridge and Clear Creek. This is Montana, Brenda. Snowmobiling is what people do here. Meadow Ridge and Clear Creek don't have the refined community standards that Pine Valley Estates maintains. We're cultivating a certain quality of life here, Mr. Bartlett." She adjusted her clipboard. "Besides, snowmobiles are noisy, environmentally damaging, and frankly, they're a liability issue. The board voted unanimously to ban them. The board being you, Susan Chen, and Margaret Fletcher, the duly elected representatives of this community, yes." I wanted to argue more, but I could see it was pointless. Brenda had that look in her eye, the one that said she was already rehearsing her victory speech for the next HOA meeting. I folded the warning and shoved it in my pocket. "Fine. Whatever. I'm glad we could resolve this civilly." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Bartlett, your garbage bins were visible from the street last Tuesday, a full 6 hours after collection ended. That's a violation as well. Please be more mindful." She walked away before I could respond, her designer boots crunching through the snow that had fallen the night before. I watched her go, feeling that familiar frustration building in my chest. This was the third time this year Brenda had found some new rule to enforce against me. First, it was my front door color, apparently rustic red, wasn't on the approved color palette. Then it was my mailbox, which was 2 inches shorter than regulation height. Now it was my snowmobile. I'd moved to Pine Valley Estates 16 years ago, back when it was just a quiet cluster of houses on the outskirts of Whitefish, Montana. Back then, there was no HOA, no bylaws, no Brenda Morrison telling you how to live your life. It was just neighbors being neighbors, enjoying the mountain lifestyle that had drawn us all here in the first place. Then the development company sold the last plots, built those cookie-cutter McMansions on the west side, and suddenly we had an HOA. Brenda had moved into one of those McMansions 5 years ago with her investment banker husband Derek, who I'd maybe seen 3 times total. She'd been elected HOA president within 6 months, running on a platform of elevating community standards. What that really meant was making everyone's life miserable with an endless stream of regulations. I went back to working on my snowmobile, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The thing was, those trails weren't just trails to me. My dad and I had carved some of them out ourselves when I was a teenager, before any of these houses existed. We'd spent whole winters exploring the backcountry, mapping routes through the forest. After he died 8 years ago, snowmobiling had become my way of staying connected to those memories. My phone rang. It was my buddy Marcus Hayes from 2 streets over. "Dude, did Brenda just hit you up about the snowmobile ban?" he asked. "You saw that?" I watched the whole thing from my window. "She's been on a rampage all week. Hit up the Johnsons about their Christmas lights being up past January 1st, threatened to fine the Reynolds for their dog barking, and now you. This is getting out of control, Marcus. You're telling me." Susan and I were talking about maybe organizing some kind of petition or something. Enough people are pissed off about the new rules. I don't know if that'll help. She's got the bylaws on her side. Yeah, but the bylaws can be changed. We just need to get enough people to the next meeting to vote on it. I appreciated Marcus's optimism, but I'd been to enough HOA meetings to know how they went. Brenda controlled the agenda, controlled the discussion, and controlled the votes. She'd scheduled meetings at times when most people couldn't attend, then claimed those votes represented the will of the community. "Maybe," I said. "Listen, I've got to finish this tune-up. I'll call you later." After I hung up, I sat there in my garage looking at my snowmobile. It was a 2019 Polaris 850, midnight blue, with custom suspension I'd installed myself. I put probably 10,000 miles on it over the years, exploring every corner of the mountains around Whitefish. The idea of just letting it sit in my garage all winter made me feel physically sick. Then I remembered something important. I went inside my house, tracking snow through the mudroom, and headed straight for the filing cabinet in my home office. I started pulling out folders, searching through old documents and property records. My grandfather had owned a lot of land around Whitefish back in the day. He'd sold most of it off over the years, but I remembered him telling me stories about keeping some parcels, including some that ran through the forest. After an hour of searching, I found what I was looking for: a property deed dated 1967, signed by my grandfather, Peter Bartlett Sr. According to the document, he'd retained ownership of several strips of land that ran through what was now Pine Valley Estates. The deed included a hand-drawn map showing the parcel's narrow corridors that snaked through the forest, connecting to the larger trail system. I pulled up a satellite view on my computer and started comparing the old map to the current layout. It took some time, but I slowly started to piece it together. The property had been divided and subdivided over the years as the area developed, but these specific parcels had never been sold. They'd passed to my father when my grandfather died, and then to me when my father died. Which meant I owned the trails. Not just some of them. From what I could see, I owned pretty much every major trail that ran through the Pine Valley Estates area. The trails the cross-country skiers used. The trails the snowshoers used. The trails everyone used. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. The next morning, I drove into Whitefish and went straight to the county recorder's office. I needed to confirm what I'd found and make sure my interpretation was correct. The clerk, a friendly older woman named Janet, helped me pull up the property records and compare them to current surveys. "Well, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "These parcels are still in your name, Mr. Bartlett. Never been sold, never been transferred except through inheritance, and looking at the survey maps." She traced her finger across the screen. "These easements run right through the Pine Valley Estates development. So I own them, definitively, according to these records, yes. You own these narrow corridors of land, and you have since your father passed. Has anyone been challenging your ownership? Not exactly. The HOA in that neighborhood has been using these trails as community amenities. I don't think they realize I own them." Janet gave me a knowing look. "Ah. HOA trouble. You could say that. Well, honey, I'd recommend you talk to a property attorney just to make absolutely sure, but based on what I'm seeing here, these are your private trails. Nobody can use them without your permission." I thanked Janet and walked out of the recorder's office feeling like I'd just won the lottery. I made one more stop at the office of Patricia Kowalski, a real estate attorney I'd used when buying my house years ago. She was in her late 30s, sharp as a tack, and had a reputation for not taking nonsense from anyone. Patricia reviewed the documents I'd brought, comparing them with her own searches on the county database. After about 20 minutes, she looked up at me with a grin. "Paul, this is fascinating. You actually own these trails, all of them." "That's what the county office said, but I wanted to be completely sure." "You should be sure, because this is ironclad. Your grandfather had the foresight to retain these easements when he sold off the surrounding land. And look here," she pointed to a clause in the original deed. "He specifically maintained trail rights for recreational purposes and passage. That means you have the right to use these trails however you want, and more importantly, you have the right to exclude others from using them. Can the HOA claim adverse possession or anything like that? They've been maintaining them for years. Adverse possession requires 20 years of continuous, open, and notorious use without permission in Montana. How long has the HOA been around? About 12 years. Then no, they can't claim adverse possession. Plus, they'd have to prove they were using it without your knowledge or permission, which would be hard if you've also been using the trails during that time. You've been snowmobiling on them regularly, every winter for 15 years. Then you're definitely in the clear. These are your private trails, Paul. You can do whatever you want with them." I leaned back in my chair, processing all of this. "So if I wanted to ban everyone else from using them, you'd be well within your legal rights. You'd probably want to post proper signage and maybe send official notices to the HOA just to cover all your bases. But yes, you could absolutely prohibit access. What if they ignore the signs? Then they'd be trespassing on private property. You could call the sheriff if necessary." This was better than I'd hoped. Patricia drafted up some official notices for me right there, outlining my ownership of the trails and my intention to restrict access to them. She also prepared templates for no trespassing signs that included the relevant property boundary information. "One word of advice," Patricia said as I was leaving. "Think carefully about how you want to play this. You're holding all the cards here, but you also have to live in that neighborhood. Make sure you're comfortable with whatever consequences come from this." I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, my mind was already made up. Brenda had pushed too far this time. That weekend, I spent Saturday morning putting up signs. The temperature was in the low 20s, and fresh snow had fallen overnight, making the forest look like something from a postcard. I marked every major access point to the trails with bright orange, private property, no trespassing signs that included my name and the relevant property parcel numbers. Patricia had advised me to be thorough, so I was. I saw a few neighbors out that morning, starting their weekend skiing or snowshoeing. They looked confused by the signs but didn't say anything. I knew it wouldn't take long for word to get back to Brenda. I was right. By noon, my phone was ringing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brenda's voice could have shattered ice. "You're posting private property signs on community trails. They're not community trails, Brenda. They're my trails, always have been." "That's absurd. Those trails run through Pine Valley Estates. They're part of our community infrastructure." "No, they're easements on private land that I own. I've got the property deeds to prove it. I had a real estate attorney confirm it yesterday." There was a long pause. "You're lying." "I'm not. Check with the county recorder's office if you don't believe me. The parcels are registered in my name." "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it, as those trails have been maintained by the HOA for over a decade. We've put thousands of dollars into grooming them, clearing them, putting up safety markers. You can't just claim ownership." "I can, actually, and I am. Consider this official notice. Nobody is permitted to use those trails without my express written permission. Anyone who does is trespassing. This is because of the snowmobile ban, isn't it? This is retaliation. This is me exercising my property rights, just like you were exercising your HOA authority. Funny how that works. You can't do this." Her voice had gone up about an octave. "You're cutting off access to winter recreation for the entire neighborhood. Maybe you should have thought about that before banning me from snowmobiling. Actions have consequences, Brenda." She sputtered for a moment, trying to formulate a response. "The board will take legal action. We'll sue you for this. You're welcome to try. I've got all my documentation in order." "How about you? When did the HOA verify ownership of those trails before declaring them community amenities?" Silence. "That's what I thought," I said. "Have a nice weekend, Brenda." I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking slightly. I'm not normally a confrontational person, but it felt good. Really good. The fallout was immediate and dramatic. By Sunday morning, my phone was flooded with messages from neighbors. Some were angry, accusing me of being petty and vindictive. Others were confused, asking if this was some kind of joke. A few, like Marcus, thought it was hilarious and were firmly on my side. The best message came from old Bill Henderson, who'd lived in Pine Valley Estates even longer than I had. "About damn time someone stood up to that woman." "Good for you, Paul." On Monday, I received a formal letter from the HOA's attorney demanding that I remove the signs and cease my harassment of the community. The letter claimed that the HOA had implied easement rights based on their years of maintenance and the community's reliance on the trails. Patricia reviewed the letter and basically laughed. "This is garbage," she said. "There's no implied easement here. The trails weren't necessary for access to their properties, and you never granted permission for their use. This is just intimidation tactics. Don't respond directly, let me handle it. Patricia sent back a response that was essentially a legal version of bring it. She reiterated my ownership, cited the relevant property laws, and suggested that if the HOA continued to allow people to trespass on my land, I'd hold them liable. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening, and I decided to attend. I wanted to see Brenda's face when she had to deal with this in front of everyone. The meeting was held at the community center, a small building near the entrance to Pine Valley Estates that mostly hosted book clubs and yoga classes. When I arrived at 7, the parking lot was packed. Apparently, word had gotten around, and people were very interested in the trail situation. Inside, every seat was taken. People lined the walls and crowded near the door. I squeezed in near the back, getting dirty looks from several people who recognized me. Brenda sat at the front table with Susan Chen and Margaret Fletcher, the other 2 board members. All 3 women looked grim. Brenda called the meeting to order and rushed through the standard agenda items: approval of last month's minutes, treasurer's report, architectural committee updates. Everyone was impatient, waiting for what we all knew was the real topic. Finally, Brenda cleared her throat. I'm sure everyone is aware of the situation regarding the trails. Mr. Bartlett has claimed ownership of the trail easements and has posted no trespassing signs. Claimed ownership. I called out from the back. I don't claim it, I have it. Those are my property parcels. A ripple of conversation went through the room. Brenda's jaw tightened. Mr. Bartlett, please wait for the public comment period. Just wanted to make sure we were being accurate. Brenda ignored me and continued. The board has consulted with our attorney, who is investigating the validity of these claims. In the meantime, we're asking all residents to respect the posted signs and refrain from using the trails until this matter is resolved. Are you kidding me? Someone shouted from the middle of the room. I recognized him as Dave Richardson, who lived on Elk Ridge Road. It's the middle of winter. Those are the only good trails in the area. We understand this is inconvenient, Susan started. Inconvenient. I bought my house specifically because of the trail access. That was Emily Park, a marathon runner who used the trails for winter training. The room erupted into arguments. Some people were angry at the HOA for letting this happen. Others were angry at me for being, in their words, a vindictive jerk. A few people tried to play peacemaker, suggesting we all needed to calm down and work this out reasonably. Brenda banged her gavel, which I didn't even know HOA presidents had. Order. Everyone, please. This is getting us nowhere. Maybe we should ask Mr. Bartlett what it would take to resolve this, Margaret Fletcher suggested. She was older than Brenda, probably in her 60s, and had always struck me as more reasonable than the other board members. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of about 80 people staring, waiting for my answer. It's simple, I said. Revoke the snowmobile ban. I'll grant an easement allowing community use of the trails in writing, properly recorded with the county. Everyone gets to use the trails however they want: skiing, snowshoeing, or snowmobiling. We go back to how things were before Brenda decided to turn this neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. That's extortion, Brenda said. No, that's negotiation. You took away my trail access with your ban. I'm taking away everyone's trail access with my property rights. We can both give a little and solve this, or we can both be stubborn and nobody gets to use the trails. Your choice. The snowmobile ban was implemented for legitimate safety and environmental reasons. The snowmobile ban was implemented because you personally don't like snowmobiles, I interrupted. There were no incidents, no complaints, no environmental studies. You just decided you didn't like it and used your position to ban it. That's an abuse of power. More arguing broke out. I could see the room was split. Some people agreed with me that the snowmobile ban had been arbitrary. Others felt that even if the ban was questionable, I was being unreasonable by holding the trails hostage. Marcus stood up. "Can I say something? I've lived here for 9 years and I've watched this HOA become more and more controlling. It started with reasonable stuff, keeping people from painting their houses neon green, making sure lawns were maintained. But lately, it's gotten ridiculous. We've got rules about what kind of mailbox flowers you can plant, what time you can water your lawn, how many cars can be in your driveway." The snowmobile ban was just the latest example of the board making decisions without really consulting the community. "We held a proper vote," Susan protested. "You held a vote at a meeting that was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday," Marcus shot back. "How many people could actually attend? 8, 10. And you call that representing the community?" This triggered another wave of discussion. People started sharing their own grievances with the HOA fines they thought were unfair, rules that didn't make sense, the way the board seemed to operate with minimal transparency. Brenda tried to regain control, but the meeting had gotten away from her. After about 20 more minutes of chaos, she finally gave up and adjourned early, promising that the board would take everything under consideration and provide updates via email. As people filed out, I got a mix of reactions. Some people deliberately avoided me. Others came up to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Emily Park, the runner, stopped me in the parking lot. "Look, I get why you're doing this," she said. "But some of us really depend on those trails. I'm training for a race in March. Is there any way you'd consider giving permission to specific individuals while this gets sorted out?" "I hadn't thought about that." "Let me consider it. I'm not trying to punish people who haven't done anything wrong. My issue is with the board." "I appreciate that. For what it's worth, I think the snowmobile ban was stupid. I never had a problem with you or anyone else snowmobiling." That conversation stuck with me as I drove home. I wasn't trying to hurt people like Emily. My beef was with Brenda and the way she ran the HOA. But I was using a pretty blunt instrument here, and there was going to be collateral damage. Over the next few days, I started getting individual requests from neighbors asking for trail access. People were polite, explaining their situations, promising to respect the environment. I granted permission to most of them. I had Patricia draft up a simple permission form that people could sign and carry with them on the trails. The catch was that my permission forms explicitly allowed all activities on the trails, including snowmobiling. If you wanted access, you had to agree that snowmobiles were permitted. Most people signed without hesitation. A few asked questions, but when I explained that this was the whole point, that the HOA had overreached with their ban, most understood. Within a week, I'd granted permission to about 40 households. The people I refused were the board members themselves and a handful of residents who'd been vocally supportive of the snowmobile ban. If they wanted to maintain that position, they could do it without using my trails. Brenda was livid. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming that my permission forms were illegitimate and that anyone who signed them was enabling harassment. She also announced that the HOA's attorney had found significant weaknesses in my ownership claims and that they were moving forward with legal action. This was a bluff, and I knew it. Patricia had been communicating with the HOA's attorney, and apparently he'd privately admitted that my ownership was legitimate, but that he had to represent his client's interests. He'd suggested a settlement, essentially what I'd already proposed, but Brenda had refused. "She's backed herself into a corner," Patricia told me over the phone. She made this huge stand about the snowmobile ban being necessary, and now she can't back down without looking weak. So she's doubling down, even though she knows she's going to lose. What happens next? If they file suit, we'll win. It might take a few months and cost some money in legal fees, but the outcome isn't in doubt. The question is whether Brenda will actually go through with it, or if she'll come to her senses first. Brenda went through with it. In early February, I was served with a lawsuit from the Pine Valley Estates HOA. They were suing for declaratory relief, asking the court to declare that an implied easement existed over the trails and that I couldn't restrict access. They also threw in some claims about harassment and creating a nuisance. Patricia filed our response, which included a counterclaim for trespass, and asked for damages to cover my legal fees. She also requested a preliminary injunction to immediately stop anyone without my permission from using the trails. "You're escalating this," she warned me. "If the judge grants the injunction, you'll have people really angry at you. Are you sure you want to go that far?" I thought about it. "Do it. Brenda needs to understand she can't bully people." The preliminary injunction hearing was set for mid-February. In the meantime, word of the lawsuit had spread beyond Pine Valley Estates. The local newspaper, the Whitefish Pilot, ran a story about it under the headline "Trail Dispute Divides Neighborhood." They interviewed Brenda, who painted herself as a concerned community leader trying to protect residents from an unreasonable property owner. They interviewed me, and I explained the snowmobile ban and how the HOA had never verified ownership of the trails before treating them as community property. The story resonated with people. The comments section on the paper's website was filled with opinions, some supporting me, others supporting the HOA, most just entertained by the drama. A few people pointed out that this was a classic example of HOAs overreaching and then facing consequences. The hearing was held on a Tuesday morning at the Flathead County Courthouse in Kalispell. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and that particular smell of old building and furniture polish. Judge Raymond Porter presided. He was in his late 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested he'd seen every kind of property dispute imaginable. The HOA's attorney, a guy named Richard Stanhope, who wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck, went first. He argued that the trails had been used by the community for over a decade, that the HOA had invested significant money in maintaining them, and that I was only now raising ownership claims as retaliation for the snowmobile ban. "This is a vindictive action by Mr. Bartlett designed to circumvent legitimate HOA regulations," Stanhope said. "The community has relied on these trails in good faith. To suddenly restrict access would cause substantial harm to dozens of families." Patricia countered with the property records, showing clear ownership going back to 1967. She explained that I'd always used the trails and had never transferred or granted rights to anyone else. The HOA simply assumed these were public or community trails without doing any due diligence, she argued. They cannot now claim reliance on their own mistake. Mr. Bartlett's ownership is clear and unambiguous. He has the absolute right to control access to his property. Judge Porter asked several questions, mostly focused on the timeline and whether there was any evidence I'd granted implied permission for the HOA's use. Patricia presented documentation showing I'd continued to use the trails throughout the period the HOA existed, which undermined any claim of exclusive HOA use. "What about this snowmobile ban?" the judge asked. "Is that relevant here?" "It's relevant to timing, Your Honor," Stanhope said. Mr. Bartlett only took issue with the trails after the ban was implemented. That shows his motivation is retaliatory, not based on legitimate property concerns. With respect, Your Honor, that's backward, Patricia responded. Mr. Bartlett only needed to assert his ownership after the HOA tried to exclude him from using his own property. The ban forced him to review the property rights, at which point he discovered the HOA had been treating his private land as their own. Judge Porter leaned back in his chair, thinking, "Here's my concern. Mr. Bartlett clearly owns these parcels. That's not in dispute, despite what the complaint might suggest. But we've got a community that's been using these trails for years, apparently without objection from Mr. Bartlett. I'm troubled by the sudden restriction of access, even if it's legally justified. Your Honor, Mr. Bartlett has been granting individual permissions to dozens of residents," Patricia said. "He's not trying to completely close the trails. He's simply requiring that people acknowledge his ownership and agree to his terms of use. The HOA is the entity being unreasonable here, refusing to negotiate because they don't want to revoke a ban that was questionable in the first place." The judge looked at me directly. "Mr. Bartlett, if the HOA revoked this snowmobile ban, would you grant a blanket easement for community use?" I stood up, even though I probably wasn't supposed to. "Yes, Your Honor. That's all I've wanted from the beginning. I'm happy to share the trails. I just want to be able to use them too." "And if I deny your request for an injunction, will you continue restricting access?" "Until the ownership issue is legally resolved, yes. I don't want to, but I also can't let the HOA continue to act like they own property they don't." Judge Porter nodded. "All right, here's my ruling. Mr. Bartlett's ownership appears legitimate based on the evidence presented. However, I'm not going to grant the preliminary injunction. The status quo has been community access for over a decade, and disrupting that while the case proceeds would cause more harm than good. Mr. Bartlett, you'll need to continue allowing access pending final resolution of this case." My heart sank. Patricia touched my arm, signaling me to stay quiet. "However," the judge continued, "I'm also not convinced that the HOA has a strong case here. Mr. Stanhope, I'd strongly encourage your client to negotiate a settlement. From what I'm seeing, Mr. Bartlett is going to prevail on the ownership question, and the HOA is going to end up paying significant legal fees for nothing." "We'll convey that to our client, Your Honor," Stanhope said, though he didn't look happy. "Good. I'm setting a trial date for June if this doesn't settle. In the meantime, everyone needs to behave like adults. That means you, Mr. Bartlett, continue allowing access. And that means you, HOA, don't push any enforcement action on the snowmobile ban while this is pending. We're going to maintain the actual status quo, which is Mr. Bartlett's snowmobiling on his own property. Are we clear?" Both attorneys agreed. The judge banged his gavel and we were done. Outside the courthouse, Patricia gave me the rundown. That was actually better than I expected. He basically told us he's going to rule in your favor but doesn't want to disrupt the neighborhood with an injunction. And more importantly, he ordered them not to enforce the snowmobile ban. "You can go back to snowmobiling." So I won. You won the preliminary round. But until this settles or goes to trial, we're in limbo. The judge's order put everyone in a weird position. I could snowmobile again, which was great. The trails were open for everyone, which meant things were mostly back to normal. But the lawsuit was still pending, and the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut with a knife. Brenda was clearly furious about the judge's comments. She sent out another email to residents, claiming that the HOA was confident in ultimate victory, and that the judge's order was just a temporary procedural measure. But I noticed she didn't try to enforce the snowmobile ban anymore. Through March, I went snowmobiling almost every weekend. Sometimes I went alone, sometimes with Marcus or other neighbors who'd become friendly with me through all this. A few times, I encountered cross-country skiers or snowshoers on the trails. Most people were polite, even friendly. A few gave me dirty looks or made passive-aggressive comments about noise pollution. One Saturday morning in late March, I was out on my snowmobile, enjoying the fresh powder from an overnight storm. The temperature was perfect mid-20s, sunny, no wind. I was heading down one of the main trails when I saw someone up ahead, waving at me to stop. It was Margaret Fletcher, the older board member. She was on snowshoes, standing off to the side of the trail. I pulled up and killed the engine. "Morning, Margaret." "Morning, Paul. Do you have a minute?" "Sure. What's up?" She glanced around like she was worried someone might overhear, which was ridiculous since we were miles from the nearest house. "I wanted to talk to you off the record, about the lawsuit and everything." "Okay. I think Brenda's made a mistake." I thought so from the beginning, honestly. The snowmobile ban was unnecessary and this lawsuit is just throwing good money after bad. We've already spent over $15,000 in legal fees. I whistled. That's a lot of money. It's ridiculous. And for what? Everyone knows you're going to win. Even Richard, our attorney, has told us privately that we should settle. So why doesn't Brenda settle? Margaret sighed. Pride, mostly. She's convinced herself that this is about principle, about maintaining HOA authority. She thinks if she backs down, people won't respect the board anymore. People don't respect the board now because she's being unreasonable. I know. That's why I'm talking to you. Susan and I have been discussing it, and we think we can outvote Brenda on this. If you're still willing to grant an easement in exchange for revoking the snowmobile ban, we can make that happen. This was unexpected. You'd go against Brenda. We're not going against her. We're doing what's best for the community. That's what board members are supposed to do. Brenda has lost sight of that. What do you need from me? Put together a formal proposal. Have your attorney draft up the easement terms. Susan and I will call a special board meeting and we'll vote on it. If we accept your terms, the lawsuit goes away and things go back to normal. I told Margaret I'd do exactly that, and we parted ways. I spent the rest of the ride back feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Maybe this nightmare was finally going to end. Patricia drafted a simple easement agreement. It granted Pine Valley Estates, HOA and its residents, a permanent easement over the trails for recreational purposes, including but not limited to skiing, snowshoeing, hiking, and snowmobiling. The easement would be recorded with the county, making it binding on future property owners. In exchange, the HOA would revoke the snowmobile ban and drop the lawsuit, with each side paying their own legal fees. Margaret called the special board meeting for a Thursday evening in early April. I showed up with Patricia, and we presented the proposal. Brenda was icy throughout the whole thing, barely making eye contact with me. Susan seemed relieved. Margaret was professional and focused. "I move that we accept Mr. Bartlett's proposal," Margaret said as soon as Patricia finished presenting. "I second the motion," Susan added immediately. Brenda's face went red. "You're not seriously considering this?" "I am," Margaret said. "We've spent months on this, Brenda. We've wasted money, damaged community relations, and for what? Paul owns the trails. That's not going to change. This way, we get a permanent easement that protects community access forever. That's a good deal. This is capitulation. We're rewarding his extortion." "It's not extortion," Susan said quietly. "He has property rights." We overstepped when we banned snowmobiling without checking who owned the trails first. This is us correcting that mistake. We didn't make a mistake. The board has the authority to regulate community amenities. They're not community amenities if we don't own them. Margaret's voice was sharp. Brenda, I know you don't like being wrong, but we are wrong here. The judge told us we're going to lose. Our own attorney told us to settle. We need to do what's right for the residents, not what protects your ego. The room went silent. I'd never heard anyone talk to Brenda like that. For a moment I thought she might explode. Instead, she stood up stiffly. Fine. Vote however you want. I abstain. That's your right, Margaret said. All in favor of accepting Mr. Bartlett's proposal, Margaret and Susan both voted yes. Brenda remained silent, staring at the wall. Motion passes, Margaret said. Mr. Bartlett, we accept your terms. I'll work with your attorney to finalize the paperwork. It took another 2 weeks to get everything signed, notarized, and recorded with the county. The HOA officially revoked the snowmobile ban at their regular April meeting. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. And just like that, it was over. The neighborhood reaction was mixed. Most people were just relieved that the drama was finished and the trails were open to everyone again. Some thought I'd been vindictive and petty. Others thought I'd done exactly what needed to be done to check an overreaching HOA. Brenda didn't resign as HOA president, but her influence was definitely diminished. Margaret and Susan started pushing back on her more controlling impulses, and other residents became more engaged in HOA meetings, making it harder for Brenda to push through arbitrary rules. As for me, I went back to my regular life. I snowmobiled through the rest of the winter without any interference. When summer came, I hiked and mountain biked on those same trails, sometimes seeing neighbors doing the same. Most people were friendly. A few still held grudges, but I could live with that. The whole experience taught me something important. Sometimes standing up for yourself means being willing to be uncomfortable, to be unpopular, to have people angry at you. I didn't enjoy any of that. But I also wasn't going to let someone like Brenda Morrison use her position to bully me into giving up something that mattered. One Saturday in late May, I was in my garage working on my motorcycle, switching from snow toys to summer toys, when Marcus came by with a 6-pack of beer. Figured you could use a cold one, he said, handing me a bottle. We sat in lawn chairs in my driveway, enjoying the warm weather and the fact that winter was finally, definitively over. So, was it worth it? Marcus asked. All the fighting, the lawsuit, the stress. I thought about it for a moment. Yeah, it was. Not just because I can snowmobile again, but because it needed to happen. The HOA needed to be reminded that they work for us, not the other way around. And everyone needs to know that property rights matter, even when they are inconvenient. Deep thoughts from Paul Bartlett, I laughed. Shut up and drink your beer. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun get lower over the mountains. Finally, Marcus spoke up again. You know what's funny? Brenda put in an application to repaint her front door last week. Guess what color she wants? What? Rustic red. The same color she made you repaint 3 years ago because it wasn't on the approved list. You're kidding. I'm not, Margaret told me. Apparently, she's evolved in her aesthetic preferences. We both started laughing. It was the perfect ending to the whole ridiculous situation, Brenda coming around to the thing she'd once banned, probably without ever acknowledging the irony. The next winter came, and I was back on my snowmobile from the first good snowfall. The trails were groomed and maintained by the HOA just like always, except now everyone understood who actually owned them. I'd granted the easement freely, but having it officially recorded meant there would never be confusion again. I ran into Brenda on the trails once, cross-country skiing with a friend. We nodded at each other politely but didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say. She'd learned her lesson, even if she'd never admit it, and I'd gotten what I wanted. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't found those old property records, if I just accepted the snowmobile ban and given up something I loved. I probably would have grown more and more resentful, maybe eventually moved away from Pine Valley estates entirely. Instead, I'd stood my ground, and while it wasn't easy or fun, it worked out. The thing about HOAs is that they can do a lot of good maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable standards, organizing community events. But they can also become instruments of petty tyranny when the wrong people get power. It takes engaged residents willing to push back to keep that balance. These days, HOA meetings in Pine Valley estates are much better attended. People actually read the bylaws before voting. When Brenda proposes new restrictions, there are questions and debates instead of rubber stamp approvals. The neighborhood is better for it. As for me and my trails, I use them all the time. Snowmobiling in winter, hiking in summer, and sometimes just walking out there to clear my head. Every time I pass one of those access points where I put up the no trespassing signs, I remember that crazy winter when I went to war with my HOA. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled it, if I should have tried harder to negotiate with Brenda before dropping the hammer with the property claims. Maybe. But I think Brenda was never going to negotiate until she had no other choice. She needed to understand that her authority had limits, that other people had rights too. The easement I granted is perpetual, which means long after I'm gone, the residents of Pine Valley estates will still be able to use those trails. That feels good. I didn't keep them closed out of spite or selfishness. I just needed to make a point, and once that point was made, I was happy to share. Marcus and I still joke about the whole thing. He calls me the Trail Baron, which I hate, so naturally he does it as often as possible. Other neighbors have their own nicknames, the Snowmobile Guy, that dude who fought the HOA, stuff like that. I've become a minor legend in Pine Valley estates, for better or worse. The funny thing is, none of this would have happened if Brenda had just left well enough alone. I was quietly snowmobiling on my own property without bothering anyone. She decided to make it an issue, and it backfired spectacularly. There's probably a lesson in there about picking your battles and understanding the terrain before you start a war. My dad used to tell me that you can't let people push you around, but you also have to know when to fight and when to walk away. I think he'd be proud of how I handled this. The trails he and I explored together, the ones we carved through the forest on his old ski-doo, they're protected now. People can enjoy them for generations, and I get to keep using them the way I always have. Last month, the HOA board elections happened. Brenda ran for re-election, but she lost to a younger couple, the Hendersons, who campaigned on common sense governance. Margaret and Susan stayed on the board, providing continuity and experience. The new board has already started reviewing some of the more ridiculous rules Brenda implemented over the years. I saw Brenda at the grocery store a few weeks after the election. She was in the produce section, examining avocados with intense concentration. I thought about just walking past, but something made me stop. "Hey, Brenda," she looked up, surprised. "Oh, hello, Paul," awkward silence. Then I said, "For what it's worth, I know you were trying to do what you thought was right. We just disagreed about what that was." She studied me for a moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not quite an apology, but maybe an acknowledgement. "The community does look nicer than it did when I first moved in," she said quietly. "I'm proud of that, even if I made some mistakes along the way. It wasn't much, but it was more than I expected from Brenda Morrison." "It does look nice," I agreed. We parted ways after that, and I doubt we'll ever be friends. But maybe we can be neighbors who coexist peacefully, which is really all you can ask for in an HOA situation. This whole experience changed how I think about property rights, community rules, and standing up for yourself. I learned that sometimes you have to be willing to be the bad guy in other people's stories. I learned that having legal rights doesn't mean you have to be cruel about exercising them. And I learned that most disputes, even ones that seem impossible, can be resolved if people are willing to be reasonable. The trails are still there, winding through the Montana forest, covered in snow half the year and green the other half. They've been there since my grandfather's time, and they'll be there long after I'm gone. That continuity, that connection to the past and the future, means something to me. Every time I fire up my snowmobile and head out into that winter wonderland, I think about that day when Brenda came marching across my driveway with her clipboard. I think about how close I came to just giving up, accepting the ban, letting her win. And I'm glad I didn't. Because those trails aren't just about snowmobiling. They're about freedom, about not letting petty bureaucrats control every aspect of your life. They're about remembering that in America, property rights still mean something, and individuals still have power against institutions that overreach. The snow is starting to fall again as I write this, which means another winter season is about to begin. My Polaris is tuned up and ready to go. The trails are groomed and waiting. And somewhere out there, former HOA President Brenda Morrison is probably cross-country skiing, enjoying the very trails she once tried to control. Life has a funny way of working itself out when you stand your ground and fight for what's right. The key is knowing when to fight, how to fight, and when to extend an olive branch afterward. I did all three, and that's why I'm sitting here with a clear conscience and trails to explore. My phone just buzzed with an email from the new HOA board. They're planning a community winter festival this year, with activities for everyone skiing, snowshoeing, sledding, and yes, snowmobiling. They want to use the trails, of course, and they're asking if I'd be willing to lead a guided snowmobile tour for interested residents. I'm going to say yes. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because sharing these trails, showing people the beauty of the backcountry, honoring my dad's memory, that's what this was always really about. Brenda tried to take that away from me, and I fought back. But now that the fight is over, it's time to move forward. The trails are open, the rules are fair, and the community is better for having gone through this challenge. Sometimes you have to burn bridges to build better ones. Sometimes you have to say no before you can say yes on your own terms. And sometimes, just sometimes, standing up to your HOA is exactly the right thing to do. The first snow of the season is accumulating on my deck, and I can already feel that familiar pull toward the mountains. Tomorrow morning, I'll head out early before most people are awake. I'll take the main trail past the entrance to Pine Valley Estates, through the forest where my grandfather first blazed these routes, and out into the wilderness beyond. And I'll do it on my terms, riding my snowmobile on my trails, with an easement I granted freely protecting everyone's right to enjoy these natural spaces. That's not revenge or vindication or anything dramatic. It's just a guy in Montana doing what he loves, with nobody to tell him he can't. That's all I ever wanted. That's all anyone should want. The freedom to live your life, respect your neighbors, and not have someone with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority tell you otherwise. The HOA tried to ban me from snowmobiling. They realized too late that I owned every trail they used for winter sports. And in the end, we all learned some valuable lessons about property rights, community relations, and the importance of knowing your boundaries literally and figuratively. It was a long, stressful journey from that first confrontation in my driveway to the resolution we finally reached. But I'd do it all again if I had to. Some things are worth fighting for, and the right to enjoy your own property in peace is definitely one of them. Marcus just texted me asking if I want to go riding tomorrow. I text back yes, adding that we should invite some of the newer residents who have never explored the full trail system. It's a good opportunity to show people what they've got access to build community instead of dividing it. That's what those trails should be about, bringing people together, not driving them apart. Brenda forgot that in her quest for control. I nearly forgot it in my quest for vindication. But we found our way back, the whole neighborhood did, and we're better for it. The snow is really coming down now, fat flakes that stick to everything. It's going to be a good season. I can feel it. The trails are waiting, the mountains are calling, and I'm free to answer that call however I choose. That's the real ending to this story, not the lawsuit or the settlement or any of the drama. The real ending is me, still here, still snowmobiling, still connected to the land my family has been part of for 3 generations. The HOA came for me, and I pushed back, and life goes on. Tomorrow, I'll wake up to a white world of possibility. I'll gear up, fire up my Polaris, and disappear into the forest on trails that are mine but that I share willingly. And somewhere in Pine Valley Estates, Brenda Morrison will probably be looking out her window, planning her own day on those same trails. We'll both be enjoying the same beautiful Montana winter, just in our own ways. And that's exactly how it should be. The end.